Today, Saturday, 5th October, I'm going to return to the main topic of these programs for the last 2.5+ years, which is the conflict in Ukraine. I say that because though the conflict in the Middle East remains at an absolute knife edge, we are still, as of now, waiting for the Israeli decision, the Israeli action that is going to happen, or at least that the Israelis have told us is going to happen, their response to the Iranian missile attack on Israel, which took place a couple of days ago. On the topic of the Iranian missile attack on Israel, there have been more dribbles of information which have been coming through. I'm not going to spend time discussing them in any detail, but I'm coming gradually round and increasingly to the view that the majority of the Iranian missiles did indeed get through. And though the amount of damage done was not on any huge scale, nonetheless, it does seem that there was actual and significant damage. And some of the pictures which show shelters, aircraft shelters in the air base in the Negev Desert, the Israeli air base in the Negev Desert damaged, might indeed confirm aircraft losses on the assumption that there were aircraft housed in those shelters. By the way, there's also been an article in the New York Times which appears to support the claim that the Iranians sought data and guidance assistance from Russia, and that they indeed obtained that assistance, and that this played a significant role in the missile strike itself. That, at least, is how I read the New York Times article. It doesn't quite say that. It pulls its punches, if you like, a little. But anyway, the content of the article somewhat reinforces my view on this. And I ought to say that I've also received information from a certain source, who of course I'm not going to identify or name, who also says that this source has received very high-level confirmation that the Russians did indeed provide data and guidance assistance to the Iranians on the eve of the strike, and that explains why the missiles were able to hit their targets, or some of the missiles were able to hit their targets and to get through. Now, all of this, of course, remains very much in the sphere of discussion and speculation. It's not been admitted by any party. The Russians, the Iranians, have acknowledged to no such thing, nor, by the way, officially have the Israelis and the Americans. But if the Russians were indeed involved, then, as I said in a program that I did a couple of days ago, the shadow of Moscow has fallen on the Middle East, and this is going to be affecting the decisions that are being made now. I say that, and that might explain also why there seems to be some hesitation, both in Washington and Israel, about the kind of attack that Israel could launch against Iran. Now, President Biden has now indicated that he does not favor attacks by Israel on Iranian nuclear weapons sites. He's also indicated, and this I find completely unsurprising, that he does not favor Israeli attacks on the Iranian energy export system, the oil and gas export system. That begs the question of what he thinks in that case that the Israelis should attack. And In the meantime, we're getting reports that the Israelis have not yet made up their minds and that they're assessing the situation and debating with themselves what they're going to do. And for the record, I think that the question of what the President of the United States wants, based on everything that we have seen over the last couple of weeks, is one of their least important considerations. It's one of the lowest issues that they have to think about. I suspect if it is indeed the case, as I said, that the shadow of Moscow has fallen, that is a bigger factor in causing the Israelis to pause and think than whatever the President of the United States is saying, which I have to say, I find astonishing, but there it is. We've said articles in Politico and The Hill, and they essentially confirm all of that. Now, the Republican challenger for the presidency has said that he actually does support Israeli attacks on Iranian nuclear facilities. Whether he's doing that essentially because he thinks this will assist him in the election, I don't know. Perhaps he supports that step. When he was president, he pulled out of the JCPOA, the agreement that President Obama had reached with the Iranians, which placed restrictions on the development of the Iranian nuclear program. Again, to what extent what the Republican challenger, Donald Trump, is saying on this issue, to what extent that is influencing Israeli decisions, once more, I don't know. But in the immediate term, I think, as I said, that if it was indeed the Russians who provided satellite and guidance data to the Iranians, and if the Russians are indeed sending military equipment to Iran, then I think, as I said, that is probably going to affect Israeli decisions much more. Given that the Israelis and the Russians have a wary respect for each other, and given that there's been a long-term relationship between Netanyahu and Putin, I would not be at all surprised, and indeed the Kremlin has essentially confirmed that Israel and Russia are in constant contact with each other, and that discussions between these two countries about the general situation in the Middle East continue to be underway. And of course, we have had those reports that a call between Putin and Netanyahu is being prepared, though there is no sign yet of anything like that being agreed or having been fixed by from Israel from the Israeli or the Russian side. As I've said previously in a recent program, if a call of this kind does indeed take place, this could be the crucial event which points either in the direction of further escalation or de-escalation in the ongoing conflict. Finally, and lastly, just to wrap on a few things about the overall situation in the Middle East. There's dramatic pictures appearing of the vast crater that has emerged in the southern suburb of Beirut, which the Israelis bombed, massively bombed, about 24 to 36 hours ago, when supposedly they were seeking to assassinate Hassan Nasrallah's successor, Safieddin. There's no word so far whether Safieddin was caught in this attack. The fact that the Israelis have made no announcement suggests to me, on balance, that he probably was not there and that the Israelis missed him. That large numbers of civilians were almost certainly also killed or injured as a result of this attack. Of that, I have absolutely no doubt whatsoever. One only has to look at the size of the crater and the residential buildings and the debris all around to wonder indeed about the scale of the loss of human life that must have followed and that particular attack. But anyway, lastly, the Saudi government has apparently made clear to the United States and Israel that they do not want to become participants in this conflict, that they're going to maintain a neutral stance, that they're not actively siding with Iran against Israel, but they're not going to assist the United States and Israel against Iran, and that they still wish to press forward with their rapprochement with Iran and with their full participation in the BRICS summit meeting that is taking place in about 2 weeks' time. And on the topic of the BRICS summit meeting, President Putin of Russia yesterday chaired a meeting of Russia's Security Council, as I've said, the top decision-making body in Russia. And, well, he himself disclosed, and the Kremlin has disclosed what the main topic of this meeting was. And, well, I'll quote Putin's exact words as reported on the Kremlin's website. Today, I suggest that we discuss measures for establishing an international payment system. We are all aware that this is a serious task in the current environment and one of the biggest challenges we face. Overall, this work is progressing steadily, but it is important to address any issues promptly and to plan the steps necessary to overcome the difficulties that are being created outside our borders for us. Let us get down to work. And then there would have been a huge discussion about which we are not told anything. But obviously, this discussion is preparatory to the meeting of the BRICS in a few weeks' time. The other interesting thing about the Security Council meeting, by the way, is that two people one of them does not often attend Security Council meetings, and the other, who is a regular attender, but who has been absent recently. Anyway, two people were both present. The one who doesn't usually attend Security Council meetings, but who did on this occasion, was Russia's central bank governor, Elvira Nabiullina. And of course, that's entirely what one would expect, given the topic of discussion, the setting up of an international payment system, which is going to be discussed at the BRICS, the forthcoming BRICS summit. The central bank, the Russian central bank, which in Russia is the lead body in setting up this international payment system. And the other person who has been absent from several Security Council meetings recently, but who did attend this one, is the Secretary of the Security Council, Sergei Shoigu. Now, that again brings us back to the question that I asked a few programs ago. Why was he absent from two very important Security Council meetings that have taken place over the last few weeks? The one that reviewed and agreed to change Russia's nuclear weapons use doctrine, and the other which basically considered the overall situation in the Middle East. And the fact that Shoigu is now back, I take as confirmation that he's not in any sort of political trouble. And it reinforces my belief that he was probably away because he was probably in Iran. Just saying. Anyway, there we are. Let's move on now to discuss the situation in Ukraine. And I'm going to start today by a review of the military situation, because we are now seeing an acceleration of the process of collapse that has been gradually gaining pace in Ukraine, on the Ukrainian battlefields since the early spring. I say acceleration of the state of military collapse. I want to make it clear that the collapse I'm talking about is the collapse of the Ukrainian armies. Now, the first thing to say, and it's astonishing, but it's been confirmed by Ukrainian commentators, is that the 72nd Brigade, the heroic brigade, I'm going to use that word, I think that's what they were, the heroic brigade that defended Ugledar for years, the brigade that was allowed to be encircled in Ugledar by the Ukrainian leadership when it should have been pulled out at least a week before Ugledar's eventual fall. This brigade, which has, to all intents and purposes, been destroyed in this fighting, a brigade many of whose men are probably lying dead or critically wounded in the open fields between Ugledar and Bogoyavlenka. Well, this brigade, the remnants of it, the few hundred men that are left, have apparently been told that they're going to be thrown back into the battle immediately without being given any time to recuperate or rest. Apparently, the numbers of Ukrainian troops available to hold back the Russians in Bogoyavlenka, Novoukrainka, in the other villages to the west of Bogoyavlenka, to the east rather of Bogoyavlenka, Katerininka, Yelizavetka, all of these places. There are so few troops left that apparently there is simply no time to send reinforcements to replace the men of the 72nd Brigade. They've had to be thrown back directly into the battle. I have to say, I find that absolutely astonishing. But anyway, that is the situation that apparently is playing out now. The other brigade, which is apparently still fighting and conducting operations in this area, even though the men of the brigade, the telegram channel of this brigade, has been complaining for weeks that it is broken and almost exhausted, is the 79th Brigade, the brigade that fought in Novomikhailovka and Konstantinovka, the village of Konstantinovka. It's now been pushed back and is trying to hold the Russians back in the village of Maximilianovka, close to Kurakhovo. And they also apparently have been given no rest, no opportunity to restore themselves or to recuperate. They were apparently at one point promised that once the Battle of Konstantinovka was over, once Konstantinovka, in other words, was lost to the Russians, they would be sent back to the rear to rest and recuperate and for the brigade to be built up again. But nothing like that has happened. Apparently they are still fighting to the extent that they still can in the village of Maximilianovka, just a short distance from Kurakhovo itself. I have to say, I find all of this incredible I find this terrible, but there it is. That is what is happening. Now, there are lots of reports about the situation near Bogoyavlenka and in this cluster of 4 villages, Antonovka, Ilinka, Katerinivka, and Yelizavetka. It seems that the Russians have captured various fortifications and tree lines around these 4 villages. There's some reports this morning that the Russians have entered Katerinivka and that there is already ongoing fighting taking place there. Redovka is talking about the Russians beginning an encirclement operation of Bogoyavlenka itself, preparatory to an operation to storm this village. Whatever, it looks as if this entire situation to the north of Vuhledar is becoming increasingly critical. And again, there were reports, I believe last night, that the Russians have also now entered the other village of Novoukrainka, which lies a little to the west. Anyway, our old friend Andrei Marochko has been busy telling us about what this all means. He's given a massive interview to the TASS news agency, and he talks about the situation near Kurakhovo. He has said that Ukraine lost an important logistical hub with the fall of Vuhledar, which is now under the operational and the result is which means that all the roads leading to Kurakhovo are under the operational and visual control of our units. He then went on to say that Vuhledar was the only major town in the South Donetsk direction. Its location on elevated terrain, on a hill in other words, allowed the enemy to observe the surrounding area for dozens of kilometers, making it a key logistics center for the Ukrainian forces. Our units now have operational space to advance further. Only small settlements lie ahead. He means places like Bogoyavlenka, Novoukrainka, Katerinivka, all of these places that I've just mentioned. And he's been saying all sorts of other things as well. He says that not only do the Russians control all the main roads leading to Kurakhovo, but he also says that with the fall of Vuhledar, the Russians are soon going to be in a position to encircle Kurakhovo itself. I would like to emphasize that the liberation, that's his word, not mine, the liberation of Vuhledar is not a tactical but a strategic success for our troops. The fact that Vuhledar is located on a higher ground and after its capture, our troops are able to control vast areas. I can see on the map that seizing Vuhledar is another stage in the encirclement of Kurakhovo, as well, of course, as enabling us to advance towards the borders of the Donetsk People's Republic. The liberation of Vuhledar will allow our troops to reach the next defense line of the Ukrainian armed forces in Slavyansk and Kramatorsk. Well, that's way up in the north. I'm not quite sure what bearing the battle for Vuhledar has with all of that. But then he goes on to say, push the Ukrainian army even further away from Donetsk city and reduce the number of shellings of Yelenovka and the outskirts of Volnovacha. These are towns and villages located to the west of Mariupol. In addition, it will put more pressure on Ukrainian forces in Kurakhovo and on the logistics hubs leading to the city of Zaporozhye. And he's brought up, obviously, the question of Zaporozhye. And he says on the He refers again to Ugledar. On the left flank of our troops, an operation in the Zaporozhye region is already in progress. Control of Ugledar helps our forces operating in the Zaporozhye section of the front line. The Ukrainian command is forced to split scarce resources between two sections. This naturally weakens their front line. So the point he's making is that the Russians, now that they've captured Ugledar, have control there because Ugledar is on a hill and because it's made up of high-rise buildings. They can observe the entire surrounding landscape continuously, and they now have only small villages to capture on the road towards Kurakhovo itself. And the Russians are able to control all the roads leading to Kurakhovo, the roads in the west, as well as all the other roads. We'll come to what's going on in Kurakhovo in a moment. And that Kurakhovo is now at serious risk of encirclement by the Russians. That the disaster the Ukrainians have suffered in Ugledar is going to play out again in Kurakhovo. And he also makes the point, which I've made many times, that Ugledar was located in the flanks of Russian forces located in Zaporozhye region. With Ugledar now captured, the Russians are free to advance northwards towards places like Orekhov and Zaporozhye city, in Zaporozhye as well. And that suggests that a Russian offensive in the Zaporozhye area, the 130,000 troops commanded by General Teplinsky, that offensive with those troops is now just a matter of time. Probably it will begin after the Rasputitsa, after the period of the autumn rains. We must expect soon, I think, a Russian attempt to capture Orekhov in Zaporozhye region and then to move on towards the city of Zaporozhye. Anyway, there we go. That's what Marochko was telling us. Now, we've had a cascade of news coming from the area of Selidovo, Kurakhovo, and all of those places. And the first thing to say is that we've had reports this morning, all of which appear to confirm that the village of Tsukurinye, north of Kurakhovo and south of Selidovo, that this village has been almost completely captured by the Russians. There's pictures showing Russian troops, both apparently in the east and central parts of Tsukurinye. But the very latest reports that I heard this morning were that there's just a few buildings, apparently a chicken farm, located in the west of Tsukurinye, which is still tentatively controlled by the Ukrainians. But it looks as if the Ukrainians are about to lose their positions there, and almost certainly by the end of today, and perhaps even as of the time that this program is being made, the whole of Tsukurinye will be entirely under Russian control. Now, the Russian Defense Ministry has informed us today, they've confirmed that the village of Zelanye Drucha is now fully under Russian control. The Russians, some days ago, about a week ago, announced that they control Zelanye Pershe. They've apparently now also captured Zelanye Drucha. And yesterday, I discussed the fact that we are looking at the potential operational encirclement of a significant group of Ukrainian troops located in a cluster of small villages and towns northeast of Kurakhovo, to be more precise, northeast of the Kurakhovo reservoir, in places like Alexandropil, Vovchenka, Kurakhovka, Zoryani, Girnik, where apparently the Russians already control a part of the town, and Novoselidivka and Izmailivka. Well, the Russians have tightened their grip, their circle, their potential circle around the Ukrainian troops in these villages. They've done it firstly by capturing Zelensky, Drucha. As I said, they've about to capture and perhaps have already captured Tsukurinye. There were reports this morning that Russian troops are indeed fighting inside Novoselidivka, which is one of the villages immediately to the south of Tsukurinye, and that they've also entered the village of Izmailivka. And there are also reports that Russian drones are now active along all of the roads in this area as well. And it's starting to look as if the Russians here are indeed intent on creating a cauldron that they could be pushing south towards the Kurakhovo reservoir, cutting off these Ukrainian troops in Izmailivka, Girnik, Zoryanye, Kurakhovka, Alexandropil, and Vovchenka completely. And I said about a week ago, in fact, that the Russians, according to the Russian Defense Ministry, appeared to have entered and probably captured the village of Ostrivska, south, immediately to the south of the Kurakhovo, on the southern banks of the Kurakhovo reservoir, just east of Kurakhovo as itself, and it now is increasingly looking as if the Russians do indeed control the entirety of this village. That's to the south of these four villages that I've talked about. And there are also reports that the Russians have now entered the village of Alexandropil, which is one of the southernmost of these villages, immediately to the north of the village of Gostre, which the Russians captured about 10 days ago. So, a significant force of Ukrainian troops from many different brigades now actually facing encirclement. This looks like a real cauldron. The first such proper cauldron that has really emerged in this war. And it looks as if, for the moment, the Ukrainian military, the Ukrainian high command, Zelensky, Syrsky, and all of these people, that they have no plans to withdraw these troops from these villages. That for the moment, the order continues to be given to hold out indefinitely in these villages, even as the Russians are closing in from all sides, and even as the Russians now have fire control of all of the roads. I don't know how many troops there are spread out over this territory and over these villages. The military summary channel has speculated that we're talking about maybe 4,000 men. Perhaps it's a bit more than that, perhaps it's a bit less. I'm not going to try to make a guess. Radovka, which has also been covering the development of this battle in detail, says that what the Russians might do is, even as they close the ring around these troops, rather than close the ring completely, and try to fight them to a standstill, causing them to lay down their arms and surrender and that kind of thing, that the Russians might allow the same thing that happened in Lysychansk and in Ugledar to take place. Basically, close the roads, wait until the Ukrainian troops try to flee chaotically by foot across the fields, the open fields, in order to escape the encirclement, and then inflict terrifying losses upon them that way. That this is the most cost-effective way to destroy these units. Well, I don't want to speculate and discuss that, and to repeat again, I don't know what kind of plans the Russian military command has, but we are now looking at an encirclement of a significant force in the Kurakhovo area. And if this force is destroyed, say 45,000 men, 3,000 men, maybe it's only as few as 3,000, but whatever it is, if this force is destroyed, given the disaster that the Ukrainians have now suffered in Ugledar, where the 72nd Brigade has to all intents and purposes been destroyed and looks like its remnants are again being fed into the meat grinder so that they will be destroyed completely. And given that the 79th Brigade that was fighting in Konstantinovka is going through the same meat grinder as well, even despite the enormous defeats it has suffered, it too apparently continues to be fed into the meat grinder. Well, I have to say, I think that if this force in these 4 villages is destroyed, 4 or 5 villages is destroyed, and small town if you include Girnik, then I think the entire defenses of Ukraine in this southern area of Donbass is going to completely collapse. I think that we will see the fall of Kurakhovo happen very fast. And again, going back to what Marochko was saying a short time ago, what I discussed a short time ago in this program. Well, the risk is that whatever troops are left to defend Kurakhovo, some of them undoubtedly from the 79th Brigade, that they're going to be encircled as well. Kurakhovo is already at risk of encirclement. The Russians are at Maximilianovka, in Ostrovskoye. They're advancing from Ugledar. The roads, according to Marochko, are under Russian fire control or drone control. And of course, Ukrainian troops in Kurakhovo itself can't retreat northwards because the Kurakhovo reservoir, a large body of water made up of the Volcha River, is in their way. And on top of all of this, I have to say that I simply don't see here any real operational plan on the part of the Ukrainian military in terms of what they're really thinking of doing in this area. As I'm going to discuss shortly, to the extent that Ukraine has a plan for any part of the battlefronts, it seems to me to be exclusively focused on what is going on far away in the north, in Sumy region and Kharkiv region, and along the border in the general area of Kharkiv and Kiev itself. I get the sense that the Ukrainian command has basically washed its hands of what is going on in the south, in southern Donbass, where, as I said, all of these disasters are unfolding. There's no evidence that defense lines are being created west of these places, these locations. There's no attempt to pull back troops from undefendable positions and to consolidate them. As I said, it all looks disorganized and chaotic, and lives are being lost, and defenses are collapsing, and there doesn't seem to be any real idea or plan about what to do. Now, further north, the Russians continue to advance on either side, on both on the north and on the southern side of Selidovo as well. This is a much bigger place. Well, Kurakhovo and Selidovo are about the same size, actually. But anyway, Selidovo, just like Kurakhovo, is close to being encircled. In fact, I'm going to go further. I'm going to say that Selidovo is much closer to being encircled than Kurakhovo itself is. And the Russians, as we know, are present in the eastern part of Selidovo already. They've been there for some time, and the Russians have established strong positions in the south, and they're advancing in the north, and they're coming close to closing the supply lines to Selidovo from the north, from Pokrovsk. And they're also, now that they've captured or are about to capture Sukurinye, it looks like they're very close to cutting the remaining railway lines and roads into Selidovo from the west as well. And another operational encirclement appears to be playing out around Selidovo. And again, I don't get the sense that the Ukrainian military leadership, the Ukrainian high command, has really much plan or idea about what to do. It might be logical to try to withdraw from Selidovo to save the men who are there. It might be logical to try and establish defense lines, even if those defense lines are all the way west on the Dnieper to defend places like Zaporozhye city and Dnipro. But there's no word, no word from any Ukrainian source that I am aware of that anything like that is being done. Anyway, that's the situation there. Further north, there's complicated battles, probably not on a very big scale, as the Russians, now that they control Nikolaevka, just south of Mirnograd, in other words, just south of Pokrovsk itself, they've entered Lysivka, as I discussed recently in the program. This is a big village west of Novogrodivka, south of Pokrovsk. They've entered Lysivka. Presumably, they will be pushing west from Lysivka fairly soon, aiming to capture places like Suchy Yar and Dachinske. All of these places, once they're captured, will further close the ring, by the way, around Selidovo further south, and put the Russians in a very strong position to push northwards towards Pokrovsk itself, to begin the storming operation of Pokrovsk. And in earlier programs, about 2-3 weeks ago, I was talking about the critical importance for the Russians of clearing the main road, the big highway that goes from Donetsk city all the way north to Mirnograd, and which passes close to Selidovo. As far as I could see, the Russians now control every part of this road. Most probably, the Ukrainians had mined the road before they abandoned it, and large areas of the road were probably damaged. but it's a reasonable guess that the Russians will have repaired the road by now and cleared it of mines, and we must assume that Russian supply convoys are trundling up the road every day, every hour of every day, ensuring that the Russian troops in this area receive a constant flow of supplies and reinforcements of ammunition and fuel and medical equipment and extra supplies of tanks and all that, so that they can maintain the pace of this offensive against a Ukrainian force which is gradually becoming fragmented and encircled, and which looks to me increasingly like it's been abandoned by its command. So when I spoke at the beginning of this program about the pace of events accelerating, I think we can see how. And I think we can see that with every hour that passes, not just the logistical situation for Ukraine with the likely fall of Pokrovsk fairly soon, but the state of the Ukrainian army in western Donbass is moving towards total collapse. I would add that when the Rasputitsa comes in a few weeks, when the rains close in, well, movement across the fields will be impossible. And of course, if this is the point where the circle around the Ukrainian troops who are caught in the villages, the 5 villages that I spoke about, the villages like Vovchenka, Alexandropol, Kurakhovo, Zoryanye, Izmailivka, the town of Girnik. If this is the moment when the Ukrainian troops decide that they must flee, well, if the roads are closed and the fields have become marshy, well, I just don't want to even try to imagine what's going to happen. As a walker, somebody who's done a lot of walking in my time, in good conditions, in daylight hours, I just don't want to even think what the effect on the Ukrainians would be if they had to try and retreat across this type of terrain with the Russians all around them and with the drones and the artillery and all of that prowling and looking to destroy them. So that's the situation in the critical area in western Donbass, the Schwerpunkt area. Denis Pushilin, the head of the of the Donetsk regional government, says that the liberation of the whole of Donbass is now coming within sight, and it is difficult to argue with him. Now, if we're talking about other places, in Toretsk, there's reports that the Russians have now managed to cut all of the supply roads to the Ukrainian troops that are present in one of the last remaining suburbs of Toretsk, in the southwestern part of Toretsk, a place I believe called Zhurablka. Probably got its name wrong. But anyway, it looks as if this area is likely to fall fairly soon. Without supplies, it's very difficult to see how the Ukrainian troops there can withstand Russian advances. The roads mean that they will not get supplies. They might be able to retreat again across country roads and fields. But again, if they do, they will suffer very heavy losses. And once more, one would have thought that the Ukrainian command, which ought to want to try to conserve its forces at this time, well, they would be thinking about withdrawing from undefendable suburbs like this before the supply roads were cut, when it became clear that the supply roads were about to be cut. And again, it looks as if the lives of hundreds of Ukrainian soldiers are being put in jeopardy because of a general refusal by Zelensky and Syrskyi and the other leaders, Ukrainian leaders, to countenance withdrawals, to countenance timely withdrawals. The contrast, again, just to say, is with the Russian approach. During Ukraine's autumn offensives of 2022, the Russians were prepared to cede large areas of ground in Kharkiv and Kherson region in order to conserve their forces. And on a much smaller scale, they've done that on many occasions when it looked as if they decided to hold on to their positions, those forces might be at risk of being lost. And the result is that the Russian army is now in much better shape than the Ukrainians are. And of course, the Russian army is much bigger and it's growing in size and scale all the time. And the Ukrainian army is getting smaller and is not in a position to absorb the losses that this strange policy of stubborn defense everywhere is inflicting upon it. Anyway, I said that it looks to me as if Zelensky's priority, his overriding focus, continues to be in the north. There are reports that today he has just arrived in Sumy, the city of Sumy, in Sumy region, close to the Russian-Ukrainian border. It's just across the border that the Ukrainians have established their pocket around the small town of Suja in Kursk region that they occupy. Group of Forces North continues to claim that they are gradually shrinking the size of this pocket. The last report from them that I saw spoke of them having advanced by 4.5 kilometers, though I don't know where and in what way. But anyway, fighting in the Kursk pocket continues, and Zelensky has arrived in Sumy region. And apparently one of the purposes of his arrival in Sumy region is that he's talking about, or so some of the reports say, he's talking about setting up defenses, strengthening Ukrainian defenses in Sumy region, which suggests that he anticipates that at some point over the next few weeks, the Kursk pocket will collapse. But if so, he shows no interest in withdrawing his troops from the Kursk pocket. On the contrary, I read yesterday that once again, the 47th Mechanized Brigade, that brigade which has been Ukraine's principal fire brigade, they've been sending it from one part of the front lines to another whenever problem or a crisis arises, that this brigade has again been asked to deploy some of its battalions to Kursk region to try to stem the momentum of the Russian offensive that is taking place there. And as I've discussed already, more and more of Ukraine's best troops and its increasingly limited numbers of tanks and armoured vehicles are deployed to Sumy and Kursk region in order to try to sustain the Kursk pocket as long as possible and presumably to establish defences there. And all of the indications, as far as I can tell, are that Zelensky remains rigidly focused on what is going on in the battles in the north. He doesn't appear to understand or be especially interested in the gathering disaster that is developing in the south, in Pokrovsk and Kurakhovo and Selidovo, and of course Ugledar has now fallen, and before long we could see a Russian advance towards Zaporozhye city as well. And I wonder whether there might be some kind of psychological explanation to this. Yesterday I mentioned that the former NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg has provided an interview to the Financial Times in which he brags about how the West called Putin's bluff and how he he regrets the fact that the West didn't supply weapons earlier and sooner to Ukraine than it did, and that had it done so, all would have been better. But, just to say, the most interesting thing for me about this article, this huge interview that Stoltenberg has given, is that it dents the narrative that has been created about Zelensky's Churchillian performance in Kiev in late February, early March 2022, when the Russians began the special military operation. It seems that for at least 2 days, the NATO leadership, the Western powers, effectively lost contact with Zelensky as he hid inside a bunker in Kiev, afraid that the Russians were out to capture or kill him. And apparently the impression one gets from Stoltenberg's words, he was in a state of considerable fear. And this has just been confirmed by the former Israeli Prime Minister, Naftali Bennett, who acted or tried to act as a mediator between the Russians and the Ukrainians at that time, and who was, of course, in contact with both Putin and Zelensky. Now, Naftali Bennett also says that, contrary to the Zelensky legend, the Churchillian legend that's been built around Zelensky, he was indeed hiding inside a bunker, afraid that the Russians would come for him. And he was telling Naftali Bennett that he was afraid that the Russians wanted to kill him. And Naftali Bennett says that in one of his meetings with Putin, he asked Putin directly, "Do you intend to kill Zelensky?" And Putin said, "No, we have no intention of trying to kill Zelensky." And Naftali Bennett apparently said, "Do I have your word?" He asked this question to Putin. "Do I have your word that you are not aiming to kill Zelensky?" And Putin effectively said yes. The Russians at that time had no plan to kill Zelensky. And Naftali Bennett then communicated this fact to Zelensky. And this is the point when Zelensky emerged from his bunker and basically turned up in his office and in the presidential building, Bankovka, as it's called, in Kiev, and told everybody, "I'm not afraid." Well, let me just make a quick observation about all of this. We see here the contrast between the Russians, who were not interested, especially at that time, in decapitation strikes, and the way the Israelis have conducted their operations in the Middle East, where they most emphatically have been conducting decapitation strikes. I think the Russians calculate that decapitation strikes are not to their advantage, And as I've said already, given the eccentric decision making that he makes, from a Russian point of view, Zelensky is the gift that keeps giving. He prevents possible moves towards a negotiated settlement of a kind that the Russians might not want, and he makes decisions on the battlefields which play to Russian advantage. But putting all that aside, putting aside the fact that the Russians have a general aversion to decapitation strikes, in contrast to the way the Israelis and the Western powers conduct themselves, the thing to say is that in February, March 2022, the Russians wanted to negotiate a peace with Zelensky. We now know that on the very first day of the special military operation, Putin's aide, Dmitry Kozak, actually telephoned the Ukrainians and told them as much. So given that they wanted to negotiate an agreement with Zelensky, which they almost managed to do with the agreement that was reached in Istanbul, the draft agreement that was reached in Istanbul, it makes complete sense that the Russians in February and March 2022 were not aiming to kill or capture Zelensky. Just saying. It's understandable, however, if Zelensky himself didn't at the time quite understand that. But anyway, the key point here is that it's clear that for Zelensky, the first few weeks of the special military operation were a terrifying and traumatic experience. The Russians were only a few hundred meters away from his office. He was terrified that the Russians might at some point want to kill him. He spent some of that time, several days, hiding inside a bunker, cowering inside a bunker, if you want to use more dramatic language. He was out of touch with his allies in the West. Stoltenberg, in his interview with the Financial Times, actually says that it was touch and go, that the whole thing might have collapsed and seemed on the brink of doing so in the first few weeks. And it was only, as I said, Russian policy seeking a negotiation which arguably averted that. Now, given that this is so, I think it is completely understandable at a psychological level that Zelensky is anxious to keep the Russians as far away from Kiev, which is where Zelensky himself is based, and that this for him is the overriding priority, and that he is more concerned about that than anything else, and is less engaged with what is going on further south in Kurakhovo, Selidovo, and Pokrovsk, and places like that. And that's why he visits Sumy region. That's why he transfers troops from the south and transfers them to the north. That's why he keeps his best troops in the north. And that is why he's constantly agitating for permission to launch strikes into Russia with long-range missiles. Those strikes logically can only take place in the north because Ukrainian forces in the south are located too far from Russia's most important border areas for missile strikes to be able to take place there. So one can understand the core feelings here. There may be another factor as well, which is, of course, that if at some level Zelensky understands that Donbass is lost, that the Battle of Donbass is going to end with Donbass falling entirely under Russian control, and that there is no realistic possibility of Ukraine ever being able to retake it. Well, he's going to be less worried about clinging on to places like Pokrovsk, Selidovo, Kurakhovo, and, by the way, Toretsk and Chasiv Yar. We've not had much information about what's going on in Chasiv Yar, but to repeat again, I suspect that we're going to see a rapid collapse in Chasiv Yar as well. Denis Pushilin, the head of the Donetsk regional government, has said that the Russians have made significant progress in Chasiv Yar. He's just said that in an interview with TASS, and that may be true. So it could be that Zelensky's less interested in that. He understands that these places are going to be lost, and he doesn't ultimately care to the same extent about them. That doesn't explain why he won't allow Ukrainian troops to be withdrawn from these places. Just saying. It makes his continued insistence that every millimeter of ground be defended even more inexplicable and, I would say, callous. But anyway, he's in Sumy region, and he's also apparently, according to reports that are appearing in the Ukrainian social media, now planning another massive personnel purge in Kiev. Supposedly, a whole new set of people are about to be sacked. Nobody quite knows whom, but the reports center on two individuals. One is Ukraine's entirely incompetent and nondescript defense minister, Rustem Umarov, who I think, frankly, is a cipher. I get the sense that all the key decisions are made by Zelensky himself and Syrskyi and another small group of people. My own sense is that Umarov, if he is going to be sacked, is being sacked to take away attention from the far more important sacking, which is also apparently being discussed, which is the potential sacking of Ukraine's military intelligence chief, Kirill Budanov. Now, Strana, one of the best Ukrainian websites, actually it's a very fine magazine. I believe it's now published outside Ukraine because of the restrictions on publication that exist there. But they're now saying that the plan to sack Umarov and Budanov is still in place in light of American objections. A decision has been made to put off the sacking of these two senior officials until after the US presidential election. And that may be true. Way back last year, it took several weeks of infighting and rumor and steps to undermine various Ukrainian officials, and also, by the way, assassination attempts, as I very well recall. Assassination attempts which have never really been explained, and a mysterious accident suffered by one of Zelensky's aides. Anyway, it took weeks before Zelensky was finally able to sack General Zelensky, even though he clearly wanted to sack General Zelensky. And by the way, the Ukrainian general, retired General Krivonos, who is one of the major commentators about the war in Ukraine itself, he's now disclosed that the rumors that were circulating in the late spring, early summer of 2023, the time when Zelensky, for a couple of weeks, mysteriously disappeared, that Zelensky had been injured as a result of a Russian missile attack, that those rumors were true, and that Zelensky was indeed wounded over the course of that attack and was for several weeks effectively off sick, and that he only survived because the building in which he was located, presumably a command bunker somewhere, was extremely well fortified. Anyway, put all that aside, it took Zelensky ages to sack Zelensky, and it would not be at all surprising, it would be consistent with that pattern, if it's also proving very difficult for Zelensky to sack Budanov. I remember that when Zelensky was seeking to sack Zelensky, one of the problems that Zelensky ran into was that it was very difficult to find a Ukrainian officer who was prepared to take Zelensky's place. Eventually, Syrskyi did so. I'm going to make a guess. It's going to be even more difficult to find a Ukrainian officer prepared to take Budanov's place. Now, the question is, however, and I think given that all of these rumors are circulating so widely, why would Zelensky want to sack Budanov at this particular time? Well, Budanov has a reputation for being one of the most ruthless and hardline operators in politics in Kiev. And he's also a rather tough and aggressive character. It's said that he gets on very badly with Zelensky's chief of staff, Andrei Yermak, that it is Yermak who basically wants Budanov sacked. I am going to guess that probably there is increasing criticism of Budanov as well. As I've discussed in many programs, Budanov ultimately is a special forces officer. He heads Ukrainian military intelligence, but there's never been much evidence that he's really interested in the intelligence, the data collection side of things. And he has been repeatedly wrong about Russian military capabilities. His primary focus has been on James Bond type activities, assassinations of people inside Russia, sabotage attempts, that kind of thing. Nonetheless, he's become a legendary figure in Ukraine itself, and he has, as we know, strong support from certain people within the intelligence communities in the West, notably in the United States and Britain. So why would Zelensky want to sack him? There's no sign up to now that Budanov has ever sought political power in Kiev, that he's intrigued against Zelensky. Well, there are a number of theories. Theory one, and this is one theory that I've actually seen floated in Ukrainian Telegram channels, that Budanov is now telling Ukrainian officials that the war is lost, that he's got the intelligence that backs this. He is, after all, an intelligence officer, that it is time for Ukraine to make peace. That's one possibility. This would be unwelcome advice to Zelensky and Syrskyi and Yermak. They want the war to continue, so that Budanov is going to be sacked for that reason. The alternative view, which I've not seen anybody suggest, is on the contrary, that Budanov is an extreme hardliner, that he doesn't want to countenance any negotiations at all, and that he's been removed from the scene so as to make negotiations possible. I don't think this is the case. Nobody is suggesting it, but it will be more consistent with Budanov's history and reputation than the first theory. I am going to suggest that there is a third reason, and it's the true one, and that is that Zelensky has just gone to Sumy, city of Sumy. He's talking about setting up defenses there. It looks as if he anticipates the collapse of the Kursk operation, the Suja pocket, and the blame is going to be placed on Budanov, that Budanov is being set up for the blame, that the story is going to be put about that it was Budanov's idea to launch this operation. He expected that it would cause the Russians to slow their offensive in Donbass, that he underestimated the resilience of the Russian forces in Kursk region, that he is the sole begetter of the whole enterprise, and the reason for its complete failure is entirely down to him. Whatever the reason for all of these intrigues, again, they are consistent with a disintegrating political situation in Kiev. Now, all of this is going on, but there is no plan. I've discussed how the Ukrainian army doesn't seem to have a plan about how to deal with the escalating crisis in the Pokrovsk, Kurakhovo, Selidovo area. The situation in Toretsk is terrible. The situation near Kupiansk is apparently equally bad, though I don't quite understand it, or at least not to the same level of detail. The Kursk pocket is at serious risk of being encircled as well. And it looks as if the priority of the authorities in Kiev, of Zelensky and his officials, is to try to preserve their position by hunting for scapegoats and playing increasingly vicious political games. As for the Western powers, they're all at the moment tied up either with their own domestic problems or with the crisis in the Middle East. Now, I'm going to finish this program by referring to an extremely fine article that has been published by the historian Geoffrey Roberts, who has been looking at Ukraine's options at this time. And it's an article that he's published, that's been published in Brave New Europe. And Geoff Roberts, who, by the way, just to declare an interest, I know him very well. Well, I know him well. I don't know about very well. But we've actually met in London. He's appeared on programmes with us on the Duran, Glenn Deason and myself. I've read his books. I have a very highest regard for him as a historian. But anyway, again, I think he's giving absolutely the correct advice. And he's basically saying that Ukraine has a choice. Either go for a Versailles type agreement or a Brest-Litovsk type agreement. Versailles was the agreement that Germany reached with the victorious Allies in 1918. In some ways, it was a harsh peace, but Germany had not been comprehensively defeated. It agreed an armistice. It came to a peace agreement, and the peace agreement meant that Germany survived, that Germany was mostly unoccupied. By the mid-1920s, as Jeff Roberts points out, the German economy had stabilized and begun its recovery. And, well, obviously, things afterwards went disastrously wrong in ways that we all know. But the point is that by recognizing in November 1918 that the war was lost, and seeking an armistice then, and negotiating a peace treaty, the Germans were able to come out of the war intact and as an independent country. And Jeff Roberts contrasts this with the policy pursued by the Bolshevik leadership after the October Revolution, when they tried to negotiate peace with the Germans. They didn't really aim for proper peace with the Germans. They were not negotiating with the Germans in good faith. They were hoping for and expecting a revolution in Germany, which would mean that they would not have to make, or so they thought, serious concessions to the Germans. The Germans finally lost patience. The Russian army at this point was in a state of complete collapse. The Germans decided to push east. The situation became critical. It looked as if Soviet Russia would collapse under the weight of the German advance, and the Russians, Lenin's government, was pushed into a peace agreement with Germany on catastrophically worse terms than they might have agreed with the Germans if they'd settled the war sooner. So this is the contrast that Jeff Roberts is making. I'm going to say this, I'm not really sure that the parallel with Brest-Litovsk works well in this situation, because I'm not sure that the Ukrainian leadership is prepared for any kind of peace at all, not even a Brest-Litovsk type of peace. But it does seem to me that the parallel with Versailles does make a great deal of sense. And I'm going to read the first couple of words of what Jeff Roberts has written. As it reels from one battlefield defeat after another, Ukraine faces a fateful choice: sue for peace or fight to the bitter end. Ukraine's ultranationalists would prefer purifying blood sacrifice to a shameful defeat, while Western hardliners want to wear Russia down by fighting to the last Ukrainian. And by the way, there are now apparently members of Congress in the United States, hardliners, telling Ukraine, go on, mobilize even more of your young men to fight in the war, to get ground down, devoured in the meat grinder. That's what we want you to do. Sacrifice more of your people in this hopeless struggle in order to weaken Russia, even though in reality, of course, Russia is getting stronger. And Jeff Roberts continues, this yearning for Ukraine to reenact a German style, he's referring to the events of the Second World War, Götterdämmerung, is shared by those Russian hardliners who believe in the pursuit of security through total victory. The alternative to epochal destruction, a la 1945, is a 1918 armistice along the lines of Putin's June peace proposal, a ceasefire in exchange for Ukraine's neutralization and the complete withdrawal of its armed forces from the four provinces Donetsk, Lugansk, Kherson, and Zaporozhye, formally incorporated by the Russian Federation in October 2022. concessions that would then be followed by detailed peace negotiations. No historical analogy is perfect, but Germany's armistice with the Entente powers in November 1918 is an instructive example of a war ending in one side's victory, but on terms that fell far short of the unconditional surrender of World War II. When Germany surrendered, and Jeff Roberts puts that word in quotation marks, in 1918, it ceased all military operations and it withdrew its armed forces from foreign occupied territories. Unlike in 1945, Germany remained unoccupied and was promised a negotiated peace treaty. There was regime change in the form of the Kaiserreich's overthrow, but Wilhelm II was replaced by a democratic republic. And then Jeff Roberts examines the terms that the Germans got in Versailles, and they were harsh, and they left a lot of bitterness in Germany, which of course a certain political leader was subsequently able to exploit, and which a British economist called J.M. Keynes strongly argued against. He argued against reparations. But, as Jeff Roberts says, Germany survived to live and fight another day and lose another day, but that's another question. The terms the Russians are offering Ukraine now, or to be precise, the terms that Putin offered to Ukraine in June and which are still on the table, are far more generous than the terms the Allies offered the Germans at Versailles in 1919. As Jeff Roberts points out, the Russians are not seeking reparations from Ukraine, and there is no realistic prospect that they will do so. On the contrary, if the war ends and there is a peace agreement, especially as Ukraine is most unlikely to join the European Union, it's most unlikely to join the European Union in any reality, but after a peace agreement with Russia, that prospect diminishes further. Well, once that peace is signed, once some kind of reconciliation, or at least stability in relations with Russia is achieved, there is a real possibility that the increasingly strong Russian economy will want to start reinvesting in Ukraine again. After all, Ukraine was once an essential component of the Soviet and previously Tsarist Russian economy. The connections of language and the synergies are still there, and there would be a geopolitical objective as well in stabilizing Ukraine and bringing it closer to Russia again. So there would be no question of reparations. The most controversial part of the Versailles Treaty, the part that Keynes criticized most strongly, and Ukraine would survive. Now, that is much better than the Götterdämmerung that people are talking about, the apocalyptic end, the blood sacrifice that some people in Ukraine hanker for, that they insist upon if victory cannot be achieved, and which some people in the West also want. And that is what Ukrainian officials should be thinking about. It's also what Western officials should be thinking about. If you want to avoid a total geopolitical disaster, one in which the Russians return to Eastern Europe in force, arrive again on the Polish border, There's a troubled Ukraine behind them, and there's a major crisis in Europe, and the United States, which wants to focus on China and is distracted now by the Middle East, would have to face the prospect of the Russians stronger than ever in Europe again. Well, if you want to avoid that disaster with all the humiliations and the embarrassments, you do what Jeff Roberts says. You agree an armistice. You withdraw from the four regions. You sit down and negotiate peace. It would be on Russian terms, but the terms are not unbearable and they are not unreasonable. Ukraine would continue to exist. There would obviously be a regime change, as there was in Germany. But Ukraine would survive and would retain an independent identity, and it might in time even prosper. And as for the West, well, it would not have to face a massive Russian army on the Polish and Romanian borders. Given the fact that there are people in Ukraine who, exactly as Jeff Roberts says, hanker for blood sacrifice and Götterdämmerung. Budanov may or may not be one of those people, but that there are many others who are, of that there is no doubt. The only way that this can work, the only way that Zelensky and his officials could be persuaded to go down this road, or if not Zelensky himself, maybe someone taking his place, would be if the Western powers publicly insisted upon it, if they obliged Zelensky to stand aside and to make way for somebody who could conduct these sort of negotiations, or in the alternative, if the Ukrainian government wants to conduct these negotiations on its own initiative, it would at that point need the full and strong support of the West if it were to have any chance of facing down the hardliners, those radical, nationalist, well-armed people that the Financial Times finally admitted existed in that article I discussed a couple of days ago. The people who would prefer the blood sacrifice and the Götterdämmerung to any kind of shameful peace, shameful as they saw it. Surely that is what the West should now be focusing upon. Well, no sign of that at the moment. And the result is that the blood sacrifice and the Götterdämmerung is most likely what we're going to get. Well, this is where I end this particularly long video today. Let me repeat again that we can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop. Links under this video. And last but not least, if you've liked this program, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.